The day started like any other, but the moment I stepped through the front gate of my landlady's house, I felt a subtle shift in the air, an unspoken warmth, the kind that makes you pause for just a second longer at the threshold. The house itself was cozy, with soft sunlight spilling through tall windows and dust motes dancing lazily in the light. The faint scent of polished wood mixed with something floral, delicate, almost like lavender. It was calming, grounding, but it also carried a quiet sense of anticipation. I hadn't expected anyone else to be there. Yet, as I pushed open the door, she appeared, my landlady's best friend. She was standing by the doorway, casually leaning against the frame, holding a mug of tea. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a way that felt effortless rather than performed. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet confidence in the curve of her shoulders and the tilt of her chin. Her hair caught the sunlight, revealing subtle highlights that framed her face softly, and her eyes, warm, intelligent, and slightly amused, met mine with an intensity that made me immediately aware of her presence. "Hello," she said, her voice smooth and calm, carrying that kind of gentle assurance that makes you feel instantly at ease. She stepped aside, inviting me in, and I noticed the faint smile playing on her lips, like she already knew something about me I didn't. There was something magnetic in the way she moved, every gesture measured yet natural, the way her fingers wrapped around the mug, the quiet lift of her brow when she spoke. I followed her into the living room, my senses acutely aware of every detail. The furniture was arranged thoughtfully, the cushions plumped, the rug soft beneath my shoes. And then there was her, sitting casually on the couch, one leg tucked under her, the other resting lightly on the floor. Even in this simple, domestic setting, she radiated a warmth and composure that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. She handed me a cup of tea, and for a brief moment, our fingers brushed. It was fleeting, accidental, but enough to send a small ripple of awareness through me. Her skin was soft, warm, almost like an echo of the comfort in the room. The scent of her perfume lingered, woody, faintly sweet, and I found myself taking a slow, almost imperceptible inhale, noticing the way it wrapped around the space between us. We exchanged small talk, innocuous, polite, but beneath the surface, there was something unspoken. I caught the subtle way she observed me, a quiet curiosity in her gaze that made me feel both seen and slightly vulnerable. It wasn't flirtation, not yet, but it was charged. There was a tension that didn't need words, the awareness of another mind, another life, brushing so close to yours, and the strange thrill of being invited, willingly, into that space. By the time I left the hallway for the living room, I realized I had already started noticing her in ways I hadn't anticipated. The curve of her smile, the quiet strength in her posture, the way her presence seemed to anchor the room. I was aware, for the first time in a long while, that arriving at someone else's home could feel like stepping into something much more intimate than I had expected, a place where moments linger, where small touches resonate, and where the quietest gestures can speak louder than words. And in that moment, I understood. This visit, this ordinary house, and this extraordinary woman were about to change everything. After the initial introductions, we settled into the living room. The sunlight had softened into a gentle afternoon glow, streaming through sheer curtains and painting the walls in muted gold. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, and quietly intimate, the kind of space where silence didn't feel awkward but full of possibility. I sat across from her, a small distance that felt deliberate yet strangely magnetic. Our conversation began casually, the kind of small talk that could have been routine, but it quickly revealed more than either of us expected. She spoke about her work, her passions, the subtle joys and frustrations of daily life. Her voice carried a steady rhythm, calm yet alive, each word weighted with experience and nuance. I found myself leaning forward slightly, not just out of politeness, but out of an almost instinctive desire to understand her better. She laughed softly at something I said, a sound that was light and melodic, like wind chimes stirred by a gentle breeze. It wasn't a dramatic or exaggerated laugh. It was quiet, genuine, and it made the room feel warmer somehow. Her eyes crinkled at the corners in that way that only comes from years of living fully, and for a moment, I felt an odd pull in my chest. a quiet acknowledgement that there was something about her I couldn't quite name. As we spoke, our movements began to unconsciously mirror one another. She reached for a throw pillow, and I found my hands brushing against hers. Again, fleeting, casual, but enough to spark an unexpected awareness. The touch was warm, grounding, yet electric in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. It wasn't the overt spark of desire, but the quiet recognition that proximity carried weight. We discovered shared interests, books, music, subtle tastes in art, and each revelation felt like a small thread connecting us. She had a way of speaking about her passions that made them seem intimate, personal, as though she were offering me a glimpse of the world she inhabited. I listened, fascinated, noticing how her hands moved when she described something she loved, how her gaze softened when recalling a memory. It was these tiny, human details that made her presence so magnetic. At one point, she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and her fingers lingered near her neck for a moment longer than necessary. I caught myself studying the curve of her hand, the warmth in her skin, the subtle strength in her gestures. I realized that the attraction, though unspoken, was already growing, not in a rush or a blaze of passion, but in quiet, accumulating moments that hinted at something deeper. The conversation eventually drifted to silence, comfortable and easy. We simply existed in the shared space, occasionally exchanging glances that lingered just a second too long. There was an unspoken rhythm between us, an awareness of each other's presence that made my chest tighten in the gentlest of ways. Every small gesture, her laugh, a casual touch, the way she tilted her head when listening, felt amplified, emotionally resonant. By the time I left the living room to check my phone, I realized that the day had shifted subtly. I didn't just feel welcome in this house. I felt noticed, understood, and quietly drawn to her. The slow-burn tension, so gentle in its unfolding, had begun to root itself in the smallest, most human details, shared smiles, fleeting touches, and the silent acknowledgement that something, unspoken, promising, and entirely unexpected, was beginning to grow between us. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted from pale gold to a steely gray, clouds thickening ominously over the neighborhood. I was preparing to leave, thinking I'd walked in only briefly, when a low rumble of thunder rolled through the air. The first heavy drops of rain tapped insistently against the windows, and within minutes, the storm had fully arrived. The cozy warmth of the house suddenly felt like a sanctuary against the growing tempest outside. She appeared almost casually, as if she had been anticipating it. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," she said, her voice calm, steady, and quietly reassuring. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just a practical solution. She offered me a spare blanket and insisted I stay in the guest room until the rain passed. Her tone was polite but carried an unexpected warmth, as if the decision to keep me there was as natural as the rain falling outside. Walking through the hallway to the guest room, I noticed how close we were. At one point, our shoulders brushed lightly. The contact was minimal, accidental, yet it sent a subtle current of awareness through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, she moved with a graceful fluidity, guiding me with a touch that was reassuring rather than commanding. The scent of her perfume, soft, woody, familiar now, wrapped around me, mingling with the faint smell of rain seeping through the slightly open windows. Every step I took felt attuned to her presence, as though the space between us had suddenly contracted. Once settled in the guest room, the storm's intensity seemed to amplify everything. The rhythmic patter of rain against the roof became a background soundtrack, blending with the occasional distant rumble of thunder. It was oddly comforting, cocooning us in a shared, private world. She checked in on me a few times, her visits casual, practical, yet each carried the quiet tension of intimacy. Her hands brushed mine when handing me a cup of water, and the warmth of her touch lingered longer than necessary. We spoke intermittently, words light and unforced, discussing mundane things like the sudden storm, the neighborhood's quirks, or favorite rainy day memories. But beneath the casualness, there was a growing awareness of proximity and presence. When she laughed softly at a joke I made, I felt it more acutely than I expected. Her eyes held mine for a beat longer than polite conversation required, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between us, a recognition of shared space, shared time, and subtle desire restrained by circumstance. Even in these simple, domestic interactions, the tension built naturally. Every glance, every brush of her hand, every quiet smile was charged with potential, yet remained gentle, respectful, and grounded. I realized that the storm outside had mirrored the storm of curiosity and attraction unfolding quietly inside. By the time evening settled in and the rain showed no sign of easing, it became clear that what had begun as a routine visit had transformed into something much more intimate. The house felt smaller, warmer, and charged with subtle possibilities. The accidental touches, the lingering glances, the shared silences, all had drawn us closer in ways that neither of us had anticipated. And in that confined, storm-bound world, I understood that this night would change everything. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the quiet intensity that only the slow burn of something real could create. By late evening, the storm had settled into a steady drizzle, the rhythmic tapping against the windows creating a calm, private world inside the house. We found ourselves back in the living room, both of us drawn to the quiet warmth of the firelight and the simple comfort of being in the same space. There was a natural ease between us now, a rhythm that had been building since my arrival. She spoke softly, almost tentatively, about her day and, eventually, about a deeper part of herself. It wasn't dramatized or forced, just a quiet glimpse into her life. She shared a memory of a choice she had made years ago, one that had changed her path, and the way she spoke of it revealed a vulnerability I hadn't expected. There was no need for embellishment. Her words were measured, honest, and carried the subtle weight of experience. I listened, genuinely absorbed, noticing the slight tension in her hands as she held her cup, the way her shoulders stiffened just slightly before she relaxed again. I offered quiet support, nodding, murmuring small affirmations, and she responded with a soft, grateful smile that reached her eyes. In that exchange, I felt a connection forming that was deeper than simple attraction. It was trust, carefully extended and quietly accepted. As she spoke, she occasionally reached out, touching my arm lightly to emphasize a point. Each time, the contact was brief yet resonant, sending a flutter of awareness through me. Her touch was warm, grounding, and oddly intimate, the kind of gesture that communicates more than words ever could. I found myself studying these small movements, the gentle curve of her fingers, the natural way she leaned forward when sharing something important, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, and realizing how deeply drawn I was to both her presence and her humanity. The conversation shifted seamlessly between past experiences, small confessions, and shared observations about life's peculiarities. There was laughter too, quiet and genuine, and each smile seemed to linger just long enough to hint at something unspoken between us. I became acutely aware of her subtleties, the tilt of her head, the way her lips curved, the warm steadiness of her gaze, and how much they affected me without her ever needing to consciously do so. For the first time, I saw her not just as the confident, graceful woman I had admired, but as someone with quiet fears, regrets, and small triumphs. That insight made her presence even more magnetic, because it was real, layered, and profoundly human. There was a softness beneath her strength, a vulnerability that invited trust, and I felt privileged simply to witness it. By the time the clock ticked toward late evening, the sense of intimacy between us had deepened considerably. The house felt smaller, warmer, and alive with unspoken understanding. Every glance, every small touch, every shared silence had begun to weave a tapestry of connection, one that felt delicate yet undeniable. I realized that the attraction between us was no longer just curiosity or aesthetic admiration. It was becoming emotional, grounded in mutual respect, trust, and the slow, careful unfolding of something that could grow into more. In that quiet, firelit room, with the storm now softened to a gentle drizzle outside, I understood that this evening had shifted everything. We had crossed the invisible threshold from polite familiarity to genuine emotional intimacy, and the slow-burn tension, the kind that lingers, that whispers possibilities without demanding them, was now firmly rooted in both of our hearts. The rain outside had not let up. The soft drumming against the windows had transformed into a steady, almost insistent rhythm, punctuated occasionally by distant rumbles of thunder. The house, once just a cozy refuge, now felt like a safe haven from a world that had grown suddenly unpredictable. I was preparing to leave, adjusting my jacket and checking my watch, when she appeared in the doorway with a quiet smile that made the moment unexpectedly intimate. "You really shouldn't go out in this," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying a subtle note of concern that I hadn't anticipated. She held her hands lightly clasped in front of her, and the way she looked at me, direct, yet gentle, made me pause. It wasn't a flirtation, not yet. It was care, attentiveness, and a warmth that felt both grounding and strangely electrifying. Before I could protest, she continued, almost casually, "There's a guest room. You can stay tonight if you like. It's safer than being out in this storm." The offer was practical, entirely reasonable, yet the way she phrased it lingered in the air, layered with nuance. There was a soft invitation in her eyes, an unspoken understanding that this was more than just a place to sleep. It was a step toward closeness that neither of us had explicitly acknowledged yet. I hesitated for a moment, aware of the small distance that still existed between us, and yet there was something about her presence that made hesitation feel unnecessary. I nodded quietly, accepting the offer, and immediately felt the subtle shift in the air. She led me down the hallway to the guest room, her movements effortless, yet every gesture was infused with a quiet attention to detail. The way she adjusted a blanket on the chair, the slight tilt of her head as she explained where the light switch was. When she guided me through the doorway, her hand brushed lightly against my back. A brief contact, almost accidental, but charged with a subtle, unspoken awareness. It wasn't a deliberate spark. It was a gentle, natural intimacy that made my chest tighten in the softest way. The room itself was simple and welcoming, a bed neatly made, a lamp casting warm light across the walls, and a window through which the storm continued to pour rain, the sound a comforting accompaniment to our shared silence. Before leaving, she lingered just a moment too long. Our eyes met, and I noticed the tiny smile playing at the corners of her lips, the quiet depth in her gaze that seemed to say more than words ever could. There was a tension in that brief pause, unspoken but undeniable, a recognition of closeness, of the uncharted possibilities that the night might hold. As she left the room, the sound of her footsteps faded softly down the hallway, and I was left with the lingering warmth of her presence. The slow-burn tension between us had intensified naturally, grounded in shared space, subtle touches, and the quiet intimacy of trust. What had begun as a simple, practical offer had become an emotional pivot point, a turning moment where proximity, care, and awareness of one another's presence converged into something profoundly intimate. In that quiet, storm-bound house, I realized that staying the night was no longer just about convenience. It was about connection, about the quiet thrill of being near someone who could shift the very rhythm of your evening with nothing more than a look, a gesture, a word carefully chosen and softly delivered. Night had fully settled over the house, the storm having softened to a gentle, rhythmic drizzle that tapped softly against the windows. The quiet of the home felt different now, intimate, almost sacred, a world suspended outside the normal rush of life. Though we were in separate rooms, the air between us felt charged, taut with the unspoken. Each footstep, each creak of the floorboard became a subtle reminder of presence, of proximity, and of the quiet pull growing between us. I rose to get a glass of water, careful not to wake anyone. The hallway was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of the lamp at the end. She appeared, unexpectedly, at the corner of the hallway, just as casual and natural as if she had been waiting. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying over the soft sound of rain. It was a simple question, but the way she looked at me, her eyes gentle and warm, made my pulse quicken. We spoke in whispers, the words light but layered. There was no need for heavy conversation. The topic didn't matter. The intimacy was in the shared silence, the soft laughter over small, trivial things, the way we both lingered in the hallway longer than necessary. Our knees brushed when she leaned slightly to pick up a dropped pen, and the contact sent a faint, electric thrill through me. It was brief, almost accidental, but profoundly grounding. Later, I found myself in the living room again, drawn to the soft flicker of the firelight. She joined me, barefoot, her movements quiet, unhurried. We sat on the couch, distant enough to respect personal space, yet close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed. Each touch was a gentle spark, a subtle acknowledgement of desire restrained by thoughtfulness and caution. There was a rhythm to our presence, a soft give and take of proximity and attention, of smiles, glances, and whispered words. We talked about small confessions, childhood memories, minor regrets, fleeting joys. The conversation meandered, intimate in its mundanity, creating a sense of trust that felt almost sacred. When she laughed, it was light and unforced, a sound that seemed to wrap around me, comforting and exhilarating at once. I noticed the way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of the blanket draped over her lap, the way her eyes softened when she paused to consider my words, the subtle tilt of her head when listening with full attention. Even in these small gestures, there was an undercurrent of longing, quiet, restrained, respectful, and undeniably magnetic. The unspoken awareness between us had grown into something tangible, felt in the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine, in the shared silences that stretched comfortably without need for interruption. Each moment accumulated, a layering of subtle touches and gentle attention that made the night feel suspended, intimate, and charged with possibility. By the time the clock ticked toward the early hours, the storm outside was little more than a memory. Inside, however, a slow-burn connection had deepened. It was no longer merely curiosity or admiration. It had become a quiet, heartfelt intimacy, born from shared space, trust, and the unhurried unfolding of gestures that spoke louder than any words. In the hushed glow of the firelight and the soft shadows of the night, it became undeniable. The proximity, the laughter, the fleeting touches, all of it, had created a closeness that neither of us could ignore, and neither of us wanted to. Morning arrived softly, the storm having long since passed, leaving the world outside glistening under a pale, gentle sunlight. The house was quiet, filled with the soft hum of life resuming, a kettle boiling, birds chirping faintly in the distance, the occasional creak of settling floorboards. The air smelled faintly of rain and wood, grounding and familiar, yet layered with a subtle warmth that felt uniquely ours after the night we had shared. I found her in the kitchen, already preparing coffee. She moved with the same effortless grace I had noticed from the moment I arrived. The careful tilt of her head as she poured water, the slight flex of her hands as she handled the mugs, the subtle rhythm of her movements. The sight of her there, bathed in soft morning light, felt intimate and ordinary in a way that was completely captivating. She smiled when she noticed me watching, a small, private acknowledgement that made my chest tighten pleasantly. We sat together at the small kitchen table, our knees brushing occasionally, the contact light but grounding. Conversation was minimal, almost unnecessary. The intimacy of the night lingered between us in unspoken ways, through shared glances, the quiet closeness of our shoulders, and the warmth that radiated simply from being near one another. When our hands met to pass the sugar or stir our coffee, the touches lingered just a heartbeat longer than needed, meaningful in their restraint. At one point, she reached across the table, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead. The gesture was simple, domestic, and utterly natural, yet it carried the weight of everything that had passed between us. Her fingers lingered lightly against my skin, soft and deliberate, and I felt an unspoken reassurance in the contact, trust, care, and a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of the bond forming between us. I returned her gesture, lightly brushing my hand against hers, letting the warmth linger without forcing words or explanation. We shared small smiles, soft laughter at trivial observations, and moments of silence that spoke volumes. The room felt suspended, safe, and intimate, a private world created from our mutual attention and the slow unfolding of emotion. Each look, each touch, each pause in conversation reinforced the subtle, unhurried connection that had developed over hours of shared presence. The age difference felt irrelevant in the quiet domesticity of the moment. What mattered was the resonance between us, the deep understanding of one another that had grown naturally and thoughtfully. By mid-morning, the landlady returned, and her presence was acknowledged without disruption. There was a simple harmony in the house now. The night had changed nothing in its routines, yet everything in the space between us had shifted. We had moved from curiosity and subtle tension to a comfortable, grounded intimacy. There was no dramatic confession or sudden declaration, only the quiet certainty that something meaningful had begun, nurtured through shared space, gentle touches, and the slow-burning understanding of hearts cautiously meeting. As I finally prepared to leave, she lingered at the doorway, her hand brushing lightly against mine, her eyes holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. The gesture was intimate, restrained, and full of promise. It was a quiet, YouTube-safe moment of affection, a culmination of everything built slowly over hours of conversation, laughter, and small, meaningful gestures. I walked away knowing the connection was real, enduring, and deeply human. A story complete, satisfying, and quietly unforgettable. Hey,